Well, first of all, I would like to tell you good afternoon and welcome to our today's discussion. I would, of course, like to welcome you at my home in Gračanica in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And we are here to start basically a first of our round of discussions with young people in the Western Balkans about what has happened during the COVID-19 pandemic and what is happening now and what we would like for the things to happen in coming weeks, coming months, and coming years in the region. This series of discussions and events is taking place as a part of a project that is run by the International Institute for Peace from Vienna. It's the Young Generations for the New Balkans 2030 towards Alternative Horizon that has started several years ago. That includes quite a number of young researchers and analysts from across the region who have been meeting, discussing Western Balkans, discussing the future of the region and the European Union for quite some time, have been publishing some great papers and some great ideas, and have been talking quite a lot and discussing quite a lot. The project is also supported by the Austrian Institute for International Affairs and the Karl Renner Institute from Vienna. And today, at today's session, we're going to discuss basically what is happening in three countries where our guest panelists or researchers are coming from. It seems that the Western Balkans and the EU have been confronted with the three simultaneous crises in the past several months. The one is the obvious one, that is the health crisis that was caused by COVID-19 and everything related to that. The other one is the economic one that is happening because of the consequence of the pandemic and shutdown and disruption of social and economical life. And the third one is happening likewise in the EU, but also in the Western Balkans. It's a political one or a crisis with democracy or crisis of values that, and at least economic and political values one, have started also before the pandemic. But it seems, or that is what we will be discussing today, is whether they've accelerated with the pandemic and whether the pandemic and everything that is happening afterwards offers a chance for us to push both the region and the relations with the EU and the EU itself in a different direction. So what we want to discuss here is what is happening and what could happen. What's the role for the civil society? What could the EU do to support the civil society, but also positive trends in the region? And what could friends of the region do at the moment? And what is for us most important is how do young people see the entire event and everything that is related to it, and how do we proceed from that? The International Institute for Peace is offering us basically a platform to discuss, to share ideas, and to come up with the proposals that we are happy to use. And as one of the members of also the advisory board of the International Institute for Peace, I want to welcome all three panelists, and I will start with Donika Emini, who is executive director at the CiviKos platform and is member of the PIEPAG. And she will tell us a bit more on the situation in Kosovo and the views from Kosovo. Then as a second panelist, we have Gentiola Madhi, who is a researcher at the Academy for European Integration and Negotiations, coming from Albania. And the third speaker will be Djordje Bojović, who is the LSE fellow coming from Serbia. So let's start with the first question to all three of you. And my question is, what has made you most angry during this pandemic in your respective countries, and what made you angry we can look to change in future? Let's start with Donika. You have a floor.
Hi, Adi. Thanks a lot. It's really good to be part of this panel discussion. It has been always a pleasure to be part of the events organized in the framework of this project, because we rarely talk about the problems and the past. We focus on the future, and we always try to somehow do strategic foresight and always be positive and give recommendations on how do we want to see the region and the EU, of course. But during the pandemic, it was very hard to do strategic foresight. It was very hard to give recommendations. It was a very unprecedented situation in which we were living as if, like, we constantly, at least in Kosovo, we compared the situation of the Yugoslav wars, what happened in the 90s, because it was so uncertain. We didn't know what was happening, and we didn't know how to cope with the situation of all of a sudden everything being on hold. What made us angry was the fact that we couldn't foresee our future. Everything that we built in the past 20 years, at least in Kosovo, was going down the drain. Democracy, which is very hard to be considered democracy, because clearly our countries have been stuck in a hybrid status quo on the way to democracy, in which we basically have been stagnating in the past years, as you mentioned, and it has been very hard for us basically to see what was happening and what is going to happen with our lives in the near future. You clearly mentioned that it was health crisis, political crisis, and economic crisis. In Kosovo, we have been dealing with something that was unprecedented, because we didn't test our health care system at all. It is underdeveloped. It was prone to and subject to corruption in the past 20 years. If you look at the case of Kosovo, in the past 20 years, all ministers of health have been subject to many scandals, corruption scandals, and it was never a priority, just like education in Kosovo. Apart from infrastructure, basically nothing was, and when I talk about infrastructure, I refer to highways, because that was the only way that the governments could actually be corrupted and misuse the budget. Then it was like we were all of a sudden dealing with a health crisis, and we were going into a lockdown, and all of a sudden a government that was elected democratically on the 5th of October, we basically had the best elections held in the past 20 years. We had a government that came from the opposition and had a reformist agenda, fighting state capture and corruption. And this government has been overthrown during the first day of the pandemic. And there have been two myths in relation to this political crisis in Kosovo. The first one, that the pandemic actually caused and the government to fail, which wasn't the case. Of course, the pandemic has created the perfect storm, but the government has been overthrown by the political leaders and political parties which have captured the state in the past. So it was, just the state of emergency, health emergency, created the perfect storm for them to come back and reclaim the power that they have lost through elections. The government basically now is outgoing. And the most funny part is that we are going to have a new government, which is going to be formed by the other parties. Meaning that the second winning party gets the mandate, which has been given by decree from the president of Kosovo, Thaçi. And the only thing that is now in the agenda is signing the deal with Serbia. And I'm sure Djordje will talk about this issue and will tell us more about the case of Serbia and whether there is a political will from which side to sign the agreement, to seal the deal. But as far as it comes from the Kosovo side, I believe that we are ready, because we have a government that is completely subordinate to the president, because it was the president that actually brought them to power. And the president, who was, of course, willing to continue continue with the dialogue. And when we thought that the dialogue wasn't happening at all, 2 agreements have been signed under the facilitation of Ambassador Brunel, outside of the Brussels framework that we actually know as the official framework of Prishtina-Belgrade dialogue facilitated by the EU. And in the meantime, we are basically having a new government tomorrow, apparently, and we are facing with economic crisis, people losing jobs, and without clear strategic plan on how to actually revitalize it. So most of the economy in Kosovo is service-based, meaning restaurants, cafes, and these kind of businesses, small businesses, which have been working on informalities, and many of them did not even qualify for government help and assistance. And even if they register just for the sake of getting the money from the government, I don't know if that's going to help them to survive throughout this period. And no one actually has a plan on how to proceed with that. So in the middle of all this, we are also still, the pandemic is there. I mean, COVID did not disappear just because we decided to go back to work, because yesterday was the first day of us opening almost entirely. We are still dealing with the biggest political uncertainty, which kind of feels sad to say this about Kosovo, because it has been, this situation has been on and on since 1999. It's just like we are plunging into crisis and just going from one crisis to another, not changing the political elite at all, and there is no hope that the things will get better anytime soon. So in a fragile democracy such as Kosovo, which basically was never a democracy, we just prefer to call it a democracy because it was on the way to the EU, and sort of aiming to be one, we still don't know what are the actual impact of not just the health crisis, but what our political leaders are willing to do just to keep the state capture on. This pandemic also, what I as a citizen, as a young person living in Kosovo, have noticed is that our education system is extremely weak. Everything was going on online. We saw how our students are learning, what are they learning, the things that they learn, and how who teaches them. And it really showed that apart from the health system, even education was never part or priority of our government. On the other side, there is one thing that we have been discussing in Kosovo. We opened up religious institutions, which is okay, but then allowing people to gather in religious institution but not opening the schools really told us what kind of priorities and where do they see the voters. Basically, it is always going for the things that make them popular among the citizens by touching up on religion and dialogue with Serbia and these kind of issues that are more emotional, rather than going for schools and things that are actually should matter for our young population in Kosovo. And this is not happening, and there have been so many confusion related to when the measures have been applied and then the measures have been lifted, and how the country will look like after this is over. What is also something that is important to mention in Kosovo, which was sort of sad, we protested from the windows with pens, and that happened only in the 90s against Milosevic. And we had to repeat it during the pandemic against our government, the people who actually claim to have liberated us and have done so much for Kosovo in the past 20 years. And this has been the saddest sequence of the quarantine, basically having to deal with the pandemic, the health issues, and also the fact that we had to protest against our government No, we weren't protesting against them. We were asking them to stay together until the pandemic is over, to not overthrow the government until this pandemic is over. And then we took the protests in the street. There have been two, basically, it was just a rehearsal because we have the red dots signed all over the main square. There have been a lot of protesters trying to rehearse to see how how the real protest is going to look like. And this Friday, there is a protest taking place, and that's Vedvendosje-led protest asking for new elections. Because apparently for the political elite in Kosovo, it is normal to overthrow a government during the pandemic, but it's not normal to have new elections because of the pandemic. So basically now we are stuck in this vicious cycle of political crisis, which is institutional crisis, also constitutional crisis, because we have been waiting for the Constitutional Court to actually interpret two of the articles to see if Vedvendosje is right to ask for elections, and apparently it is not. So now new elections are not going to take place, but we are going to have the second government within 3 months. Just to think of everything that has happened, what I realized, and this is the last point, that is really important, is that people have not lost their hopes, that people are still protesting, and they are willing to protest. I thought that in Kosovo, in the past, at least in the past years, people forgot how to protest, that we had given up everything and we just were subordinating to everything that was happening without seeing the light in the end of the tunnel. What happened now that we were deprived from this right, and we didn't let it go. Now we want it back, and the protest is the first step to tell the government that we want our rights back, and once the measures are lifted, we'll have our voice heard regardless.
Thank you, Donika. Important point. People have not lost their hope. Now the question that we will come back, I'm sure, later on is how do we use the energy that there obviously is and the hope that there is to actually steer the debate in issues that we find important, that are issues like health or education or economy and social relations. I want to say that all those who are watching us via Zoom can pose their questions in written, and we will of course also give a chance for those who joined us to ask the questions. But first we go to Gentiola and Albania. You have a floor.
Thank you, Adi. It's difficult now to talk about how Albania went through the COVID, because it started quite differently and the recent developments were really unexpected. Firstly, I would like to mention the fact that Albania has been living, at least over the past 1 year, into a deep political and institutional crisis. So the pandemic found the country pretty much divided, and mostly the power were concentrated and the focus on the hands of the prime minister. So he was basically leading most of the things, among which also the information and communication on what people should do during the COVID-19 lockdown. So over March and April, there was a fierce lockdown. People started to respecting the rules. They were pretty much aware of the fact that we don't have the necessary health infrastructure that would face the challenge. Basically, this was something that not just Albania doesn't have, but it was pretty much a big challenge that was difficult to handle from bigger and more developed countries, meaning also in first place Italy as a neighbor country of Albania, with which we do have frequent contacts on a daily basis. So in the middle of this health pandemic, when we thought that in May we were going to open up a bit and ease on the situation, we had the demonstration of a rule of law crisis through the arbitrariness and abuse of power from the governing party and government in itself. I mean, here exactly the demolition of the National Theatre. It was quite unexpected and difficult to be justified, if impossible at all, to have this intentional intervention of the police forces and the other institutions to demolish a theater which was in the same time a symbol of civic resistance in Albania since the fall of communism. All the debacle, it's quite a long one. It started already 2 years ago, where there was an unsolicited request from a private company that wanted to use the surface area in order to realize its project, the construction project of 7 towers and a commercial mall. Afterwards, the government approved a special law in order to allow such project. There were several protests. until it ended up in July last year with the occupation, a sit-in from artists, but also civic activists and people that really care about the institution. I want to go beyond the fact that for me, myself, and most of the activists themselves, the National Theatre is a landmark and also is a historical and cultural institution, but also from the side of the memory, at least from who is from Tirana or who grew up in Tirana, it was a point of reference. So taking such an action in the middle of the pandemic, intentionally, knowing that it will galvanize anger among the citizens and it will lead to protests, it's quite irresponsible. And it's not acceptable not to have further investigations and people brought in front of the justice institutions and to take on the responsibilities. It was quite unfair and also incoherent debate from the responsible people being mayor, deputy mayor, minister of culture, and prime minister, when accusing the other and not having the responsibility to say that I did take the decision to demolish. This is the first part, and the second part on which I wanted to focus is the legal procedures. In a specific case, when a country is going through a judicial reform that is going to open up its EU integration process, meaning the negotiations, it is unacceptable to have the state institutions decide, take legal actions against the legal basis. Here, I mean, the specific case was there was ongoing investigations from the special court for special institution against corruption and organized crime in Albania on the issue of the theater at the moment when the demolition took place. There were two requests for judicial review from to the Constitutional Court. So it was expected to wait the Constitutional Court to deliver before to take action. And then also the decision from the municipality council or city council to demolish the theater needed to pass 10 days before the demolition takes place. This is at least the legal basis. And even in this case, with all what I ranked, none of the political leaders, responsible institution directors and so on didn't care about. Which means that they do approve the laws, but they are the first not to obey. How can we expect then that a simple citizen in need of any kind cannot take action, and then how we will justify it and how we will find a solution? It means like we are going through a jungle. And it's not what at least the rhetorical discourse wants, at least expresses, and the joint ambition to open up the negotiations. So in my point of view, it became really unacceptable to not to respect the calls from different embassies, but also the EU side in order to deal for a dialogue, not to undertake such measures in a specific time. We still don't know how the situation will evolve because it needs at least 2 weeks before the people that participated in the protests have the signs or that are affected or not of the pandemic. Then the last point is the economic crisis. Now we will feel really what the COVID caused to the economy. There are the estimations that the negative growth is going to be -5 up to -8, which is really harsh for Albania. Tourism is the heart of the economy, and we already know that we are going to have significant losses, considering more the fact that unfortunately we have had the earthquake and we have contracted a lot of debts, among which we will contract now even the 30 millions another debt in order to build a new theater, which in my point of view was not necessary in this specific moment. So it's everything was done, the violence and the destruction in the name of aesthetics, which is quite not appropriate for the situation of Albania at the moment.
Thank you, Gentiola. Of course, we will come back at the later stage on how do we prevent from this bad economic situation and the need to create new jobs quickly on the expense of even freedom and values can be prevented, and what our ideas on that are. But now we go to Djordje and Serbia. You have the floor.
Thank you, Adi, and thanks everyone for attending and for inviting me. I hope you hear me well. Well, coming back to your question, what actually has made me angry, it's actually the state's response at the very beginning of the COVID crisis. We had a press conference at the very end of February, when Italy was already the issue in Europe, and we already knew that the pandemic is coming. We had the president with a small team of experts who claimed that this is the funniest virus ever that existed, that this is the virus that exists only on Facebook, even though already back at the end of February, thousands of people have died in Italy. So I think that what made lots of citizens in Serbia quite angry is the very fact when we realized not only the state response in that very case, but also that we have never moved from 1990s, that the political elite has used the experts, in this very case, the medical experts, to gain its political gains. And then that was very clear from the very beginning of the pandemic. So in February, we had a controversial first case, not first case. Officially, the first case in Serbia was verified on the 6th of March, but then the doctors claimed that it could have been the 1st of March, and then in that very small gap, the Vučić party, the SNS, was collecting signatures for the upcoming elections. So in essence, they didn't want to give up on the elections, but then when the situation became quite serious, they had to give it up. So we had, from the funniest virus ever, in 2 weeks, the introduction of the state of emergency, so quite severe restrictions on the political system and on human rights, etc. So I think that what made angry quite a lot of people is this inaccurate and then this irresponsible approach at the very beginning. Then it became one of the strictest and most restrictive measures in Europe ever taken in place for a month and a half. And then, like in Kosovo, what Donika mentioned, we also had protests with pens because we couldn't gather on the streets, precisely because of this political oppression. And I think that COVID situation in Serbia showed bluntly what were the problems. I would separate them in three, and we'll talk shortly about democratic issues, then human rights and judiciary, and the third one being the big turn in foreign policy. So the first one, when it comes to democracy, we actually have seen that the Vučić-backed tabloids called Corona an ally of the opposition parties. So it was that absurd that even Corona was claimed as an ally of the opposition parties, in a way that there was no other way to attack the opposition, and in a way that the boycott idea of the opposition party, of the main opposition party before the COVID crisis, was actually crippled during the Corona crisis and afterwards, which consequences we see today. Nowadays, we had the attack on a significant political leader who was collecting the signatures to present himself at the elections. So we have a physical violence on the streets, which is a direct consequence of the polarization of the society caused by the regime. So I would say that there is a huge division within the Serbian society, not only on the line pro-Vučić and against him, but also within the opposition, caused and prompted by the work of the tabloids, of the Vučić media, and of everyone who supports that side. So I think that there have been many people talking that Serbia is on the brink, on the verge of civil war. I wouldn't go that far, but nowadays we do see physical violence on the streets between different political parties, between different political leaders, and I think it's a direct consequence primarily of the ruling party. Secondly, when it comes to democracy, we had a quite negative Freedom of House report, which for the very first time states that Serbia is not semi-consolidated democracy, but a hybrid regime, hybrid democracy. So in essence, an authoritarian regime. The government got so affected in Serbia that they have written a ridiculous 18-page report to the Freedom House, claiming, hey, we are not an authoritarian regime, we are a pure democracy. And of course, everyone laughed at it, apart from the Serbian government, but it shows that the things are moving, and they actually realize that someone is watching the situation. Someone is watching the situation in Serbia. On the second level, we had a massive abuse of human rights in Serbia during the COVID, and I think that's personally my main impression during the pandemic. We had the famous Skype trials, so people who were breaching the state of emergency rules were tried before the court in an express trial, so no whatsoever fair trial standards implemented in place. They were in prison for 3 years, and now we'll see how the second instance court will deal with those cases. But these are serious cases. There are a number of them. They got trials via Skype. They did not have a right for a proper defender on these Skype trials, and they were indicted on 3 years imprisonment. And I think that's the most brutal way how a police state can show you if you don't obey the rules, you are going to end up in the jail in a prompt way. And third, and not least, is the foreign policy turn. We had quite a negative campaign against the European Union for a country that is allegedly the front leader, the front runner in the European integration. We had quite negative statements by both the president and the government members against the European Union as such, about the lack of European solidarity, and saying, hey, Europe betrayed us, but here are Chinese or who else who will help us. And then I think that main switch in the foreign policy, we have yet to see whether it's something that is to be long-term, or it just for the cause of the pandemic, for the cause of to get medical equipment or something else in March and April when everyone needed, and China was one of rare countries who could have provided it. So, but nevertheless, I think that these messages, the billboards of Chinese president in Belgrade, were something that is going to be remembered. And this subtle, but not so subtle anymore, Chinese propaganda in Belgrade is something that is worrying many people, because Serbia was quite abstained in 2012, 2013. So even when Vučić came in power, when it comes to Hong Kong issue, when it comes to Taiwan, when it comes to all these issues, nowadays, Serbia actively goes and stands by the Chinese side when it comes to these issues. Recently, the Serbian president issued a statement about the Hong Kong situation, standing along with the Chinese side. It hasn't happened before. So I think that this turn in foreign policy was not just during the pandemic. It's a bit, at least midterm or long term, and it's something that is worrying, because China, given its democratic non-reputation, is actually something that provides a model how they see themselves, how they want to rule. So I think that overall, and to sum up, these three things are the main things that overall make the pandemic situation worse, and it actually show us that we haven't moved far despite our work on the European integration of Serbia for 2 decades now. Milosevic has fallen in 2000, and then in 2020 we actually see that the situation hasn't actually changed. In-depth change, the transformation of the society hasn't occurred in these 2 decades. So I think that it's to sum up, it's the main taste that you have in your mouth after Corona. After Corona has passed, as officially it's not over in Serbia, at least. I think that it has the surface, or all the irregularities and all the hidden agendas that were there and just not presented. Thank you.
Thank you, Djordje. And just to point out for our viewers that you've spent the entire time during the pandemic, you were in Serbia. So you're speaking from the experience from
Belgrade.
Serbia. I wanted to share with our viewers that there is an option for questions for those of you who are joining us via Zoom, and that I encourage you to ask any questions. Until then, I would like to go back to Donika, who is actually coordinating a group of NGOs, group of civil society organizations in Kosovo. And I think I would like you to actually tell us a bit more, what are the circumstances in which civil society organizations are working today, not just in sense of democratic and the space that there is available for civil society, but I was thinking more about short-term to medium-term financial aspects as well. One could expect foreign donors to be now focused on creating jobs, on creating circumstances for economic development, and to some extent neglect this civil society and part. And in that sense, I would like to ask you whether you see any tendencies, whether you see anything happening that would need a reaction, or that would call for a reaction from outside, but also from inside. You have the floor.
I mean, normally this should be the most intense period of activities for NGOs. I don't know how is it in other countries, but usually Kosovo, but also like given judging by the dynamic of events organized also in the region and abroad, April and May used to be very eventful. Everything was put on a hold. We quickly adapted to the new working environment. For us, it wasn't very hard to actually adapt to doing things online, to working online, but organizing events and not being able to actually have discussions and react to the things that were happening had an impact, of course, a detrimental impact. I do coordinate a secretariat which basically gathers 250 organizations in Kosovo. I might say that the big ones have been sort of, are still on the safe side because they have had a lot of projects and donors have been very easy to adapt to new circumstances. They, of course, needed a new plan on how the activities will continue during the COVID pandemic and the new environment. Those that could take place online did, and the rest are still on hold until this is all over. What bothered me during this time was the fact that I have been approached personally only by one donor to actually ask if the civil society organizations need help to pass the period of the 3 months during which some of us weren't even able to pay the rent for offices and other expenditures. It was only one donor, and the rest sort of kept on hold all the calls that have been planned since January, waiting for what's going to happen after the pandemic and trying to reorganize all the programs to fit to the new reality. But this has been, of course, had an impact, especially for our smaller grassroots organizations or those located outside of Prishtina, which have been struggling to sort of survive in under these circumstances. Now I heard that some of the calls for applications are basically ready to be open, but they shouldn't have waited for 3 months to keep the money of the donors sort of locked and not help the sector thrive during this period, because it was very hard for us to learn how to adapt to the new reality, to learn how to find out what's going to be our role under these circumstances and in the new reality, but also to deal with all other challenges, given the fact that initially we would like to think that our space hasn't shrunk, but it did. Basically, we are limited in operational. We are not as operational as we used to be. Now we are back in the offices, but still our events are being held online. Our meetings are, everything is online, and we are not really ready to go out in the open. What also is interesting for CiviKos is the fact that we coordinate the cooperation between civil society and the government, and this is not just interrupted by the fact that we are in the pandemic, but the fact that we have been changing this is the third government that I'm basically, it is changing since I took over the office, which was July last year. So when I took over, Haradinaj was the Prime Minister of Kosovo, which has resigned, and then we had elections, and we had Albin Kurti for the next Prime Minister, and now we are soon going to have another Prime Minister. And for us, it has been constant interruption of our work with the government, and each government basically had a different approach towards civil society. Each government had restructured the government itself, and we couldn't find the right partners to talk to, which has been quite a hassle for us. Going back to, after this, to of course human rights and what is happening with the civil society. Also, it's the fact that the courts, if you open the religious institution and you don't open the courts, or the courts are being closed to the journalists or for the public, it means that there is censorship. It doesn't, and lack of transparency. It is not because of the pandemic. It's because there is no will for the institutions to go back to the normal transparency and accountability which was before the pandemic. So this is very much concerning, and many journalists have been basically constantly monitoring the courts, have been raising a lot of flags in this regard, and this is very, very concerning.
Thank you, Donika. Gentiola, Albania is basically preparing itself to start the accession talks, hopefully sooner rather than later. And the role of civil society, as we've seen both in Montenegro and in Serbia, there was a place for civil society organizations. Whether they were able to successfully push for the agenda or for push the things is something to debate, but there is a place for them. So I wanted to actually ask you how the preparations are going. Are you personally, in some respects, involved, and how do you assess how quick things will go? And there's a second question that comes from the audience is about regional cooperation. I know that you are also quite familiar with the regional cooperation, and I was thinking, and the question is basically how the pandemic and post-pandemic recoveries will affect regional cooperation, and what could be more done in that respect. So I give you the floor.
Okay, starting firstly with the European integration, it was long waited, and when the green light came in the end of March, obviously no celebration took place, and generally it's said that it was overshadowed obviously by COVID, but personally I think that the existence of 15 new conditions that Albania has to fulfill in order to have the first intergovernmental conference definitively has lowered down the expectations to have a breakthrough at least during this year. The situation now is a bit complex. This is because on the 9th of May, on the Euro Day, the Prime Minister declared that we now have a name for the chief negotiator, and it was expected, according to the legal basis in force, the decision, that we are going to have 7 members from the 7 state negotiation team. And now it comes, and when I say now, it means yesterday, that the government has modified all the decisions that are used in order to establish the negotiation framework. And obviously, this decision is not made public yet. We have learned just from one member of the opposition that we have a negotiation team of 18 members and the chief negotiator. And these 18 members, most of which are deputy ministers. Now we don't know to what extent this structure or the existing structure has been abolished, and which is the position of the CSOs and groups of interest. Moreover, I would make the link that some of these deputy ministers in the negotiation team are the same persons who sit also in the city council and voted for the demolition of the theater. So there is a diluting trust on the capacity of them to decide for the best opportunity or the best solution for the interest of the state and the citizens. And to what extent these persons, these experts, do have their freedom to decide beyond the political orientation. Because we should mention that accession negotiations and the negotiation itself is the major priority for Albania, and it should go beyond any reasonable doubts that we should follow the best interests of the country, leaving aside left and right. And at this moment, I personally question to what extent we can ensure a continuity when the government change and the opposition come to power. And to what extent this deputy minister can manage, according to the old structure, to be chairs of the working groups, to be chair of the platform of cooperation with civil society, and at the same time attend the meetings, plus their duties as deputy ministers. So the situation is pretty much confusing. Initially, at least, we knew that we had a similarity with the Serbian model, but now it remains to be explored, and we don't know to what extent or how much time it will take in order to make the decisions public, although transparency should be the first one. At the moment, we are, at least the politicians and the experts, are dealing with the reform of the electoral system. The deadline, the first deadline and the second deadline have expired, and they still don't have a common decision. And afterwards, we have to deal with the justice reform, and there have been some problems with the vetting, because the vetting of some judges a couple at the moment didn't go perfectly well, and they managed to not make public some non-positive, let's say, elements of their CVs. So they sit in specific commissions where they shouldn't be. And theoretically, one of them shouldn't have even passed the vetting system, let alone the decision that he took in the frame of vetting the other colleagues. So we are having a lot of elements that bring to quite a lack of trust and dilution of hopes in general to progress within this year in the EU integration process. I don't know to what extent we will manage next year. Definitely elections will be a must for Albania in order to make some step forward. On the regional cooperation, at the moment I see it quite difficult. The plenty of coexisting problems that each of us has at the national level shifts completely the focus from the cooperation. Even the small details or the daily politics that we are having on the border, opening and closure of the border with Kosovo, shows that at this moment everybody is prioritizing its own internal affairs, leaving aside region and so on.
Thank you, Gentiola. Djordje, we have here two questions that I would like to actually sum up and maybe a bit develop. If we think about Serbia and what you were discussing about the initial reaction by President Vučić and the government when it comes to the EU and China on the other side, has with time, I would say, a bit evolved. So Serbia, for example, has sent a flight with support and aid to Italy. It has had a meeting with the EU ambassadors with very strong messages about EU solidarity. We have seen Minister for European Integration or person in charge for European Integration sending very positive messages about the EU. So the question is, what are actually the long-term implications regarding relations with China or proclaimed relations with China, and how much of it was actually a miscalculation at the moment and has continued as a pre-election campaign, or election campaign, as one could say, or is it actually like a long-term shift in the foreign policy? So that would be the question.
Thank you, Adi. There is a saying in Serbian foreign policy that they want to pretend as if they are in Tito's period to famously sit on two chairs on East and West. But now it has evolved, I would say, because lastly, we had only this, as I would call it, folkloric loving for both Russia and China. Billboards throughout the city, state visits, but nothing beyond there in international arena yet. Recently, Serbia and its president sent a letter of support to China when it comes to China's national security law in Hong Kong. So previously, some Serbian representatives also supported the Chinese move. And this is, in my opinion, a major transformation, as in the past, Serbian diplomacy mostly abstained from stating its views on major international issues. Most striking example is, in my opinion, Russia and the Crimea, when Serbia was completely silent. With China, we see the open support. And then I would link that with the component of Belt and Road, where recipients of Chinese financing become more forthcoming in the international arena on issues that are of interest for China and Beijing, like Hong Kong, Tibet, or the South China Sea. We haven't seen that in before. So I think that's the major change in Serbian policy. When it comes to the question, is it going to be long-lasting? No one knows for sure whether it's a structural change, but I think that now we see that Belt and Road, or the financial implications and Chinese investments, do have a link with geopolitics, because previously it was not clear. And now we see that bluntly on the Serbian example. When it comes to Russia, but both Russia and China in that puzzle, I would say that it's linked with the upcoming Kosovo deal. And I think that what Vučić wants to secure, or the Serbian government in general, is a broad international coalition for the solution that is going to be as he wants in his own interest. So he's legitimately trying to convey a group of allies. Yet the question is on what costs. And I think that this balancing between the EU and Russia and China on the other side does come at a cost, because we see that Serbia is not progressing when it comes to European integration for years. And one of the reasons is definitely its non-alliance when it comes to foreign policy. I think that the consequences are going to stay, because now we see the other political parties that by replying to Vučić's more turning of Serbia towards the east in general, they have to comply with that politics. And then the number of pro-European parties that are run on the current elections out of 10 are 2. So we have a huge diminishing of number of pro-European, of strongly European parties that run on the Serbian elections. And I think that's the main consequence. You don't need another major statement by the Serbian government to see that Serbia has profoundly changed its foreign policy. And then, of course, it's linked with the solidarity as one expression of international relations. At the end of the pandemic, Vučić has realized he's smart enough to see, okay, I have to play on both chairs, on both fields, so I have to provide something to the European Union as well. And thus, his playing to Italy, his speech with the EU ambassador, etc., etc. But I think that comes at a price, and the price that we are currently paying is a strategic shift of our foreign policy towards the East, more than anyone actually sees at the moment, because officially we are still on the European integration path, right? So I think that the change that is going to happen there is actually linked with the Kosovo deal, and that was something Donika mentioned in the first part. I don't see it coming in 2020 due to many reasons. Be it the upcoming elections both in Serbia and in the United States, the fall of Kurti government, and then we don't see how is it going to be the position of the next government. Then the European Union new facilitator of the Serbia-Kosovo dialogue. We still have to see how and when the dialogue is going to be relaunched. So I don't think that there has been in the Serbian media that the room for the agreement could be before the American elections. I think that there are many things in the game, and then I would just link, and I finish, the switch in the foreign policy with the possibility of a soon deal.
Thank you, Djordje. Sadly, we're approaching the end, so I will go with the last question for all three of you, and please try to stick it to 1 minute, 1 minute, 30 seconds. I want you to tell me one thing that your country did, it doesn't have to be the government, that actually surprised you in a positive way and that goes against the usual cliches about the Western Balkans and your country in particular. Donika, we'll start with you.
Okay, just before that, quickly, what happened in Serbia was the question over the East and West, and in Kosovo it was West and West, and whether we support the US and the EU. We sort of managed, as small as we are, to basically start this big fight and contribute to transatlantic crack, which was of course started with the Trump administration, but we sort of contributed to it. Now we are standing on the verge of basically having a government that has been overthrown allegedly with the help of the US, and according to Mr. Thaci, the previous government, the Kurti government, was guaranteed by the EU and the coalition as well. So we basically saw the live EU-US clashes when it comes to Kosovo, but this also applies to entire Europe. Regional cooperation was absent, and we really hope that our countries will, of course, national interest prevail during the crisis, and that was understanding because we closed our borders, we focused on fighting the pandemic, but now I think as we are opening up, the fact that we are not opening up our borders with each other at the same time shows a lot about regional cooperation, even bilateral cooperation, and starting with Kosovo and Albania first. What did our country did, it wasn't, I mean, it was solidarity. People it was the spirit of people basically keeping us alive during the pandemic. Of course, the Kurdi government, according to my assessment, was really effective in fighting the pandemic, not as successful in helping the economy, but that's for the post-COVID crisis, which cannot really be attributed to them because they are outgoing. But what really surprised me was the fact that we actually show solidarity with each other. We help each other with equipment to continue, to support the pupils to study online. Civil society helped. They started producing masks. They started distributing masks for free. We were helping each other, and we were all equal. We were all sort of devastated, but still willing to help each other. And the fact that solidarity wasn't absent, and the fact that we, against all odds and what was happening and the loss of hope, we were still protesting in the street, and we wanting our rights back, our right to protest, to be active, to show activism. This basically surprised me for good, and I still think that there is future in the Western Balkans and in our country specifically, but it's a long way to go.
Thank you, Donika. Gentiola? So the question is, the question.
Yeah, on the good things. Well, I would mention two. The first one, as Donika also mentioned, is the sense of community that the people and the citizens created in Albania. There was this mutual and collective engagement to respect the rules, because they knew that the country and the capacities cannot fare fast of the challenge. So let's take care of each other and respect the rules for ourselves, not for the governments, because the trust is limited to the government. Meanwhile, for Albania in general, and mostly for the Albanian diaspora living abroad, the solidarity, the act of the Prime Minister to send some medical staff in Italy was highly appreciated. Mm. We know that in Italy, they had much more advanced knowledge, but it really helped the image of the country. It made the people feel better, the ones at least who remain outside the country. And in the meantime, I think, in my modest view, that it helped also these persons, these specialists that travel to Italy to understand that the challenges are the same. It's not just the way just to leave the country for best conditions, leave Albania to work to Germany and other EU countries, that will help them fulfill their mission. And I think this was valuable for them as well.
Thank you, Gentiola. Djordje, you have a floor.
Thank you. Well, for me, the most positive thing, and it quite surprised me, was actually the online education. It started a week after the funniest virus on earth. After 2 weeks, we have introduced the state of emergency. 1 week after the introduction of state of emergency, we have a fully fledged online education system for all grades from primary school till the university, running on the state TV. So I think that it started so quickly and actually so well that it quite surprised me. And we are usually very critical when it comes to the education system, which is not the greatest spot when it comes to all Western Balkan 6. Yet this has misproved all these negative cliches about the education system in the Western Balkans, or in Serbia in particular. And this is something that strike me quite something. And the second, and then I finish, is this what both Donika and Gentiola talked about, is this sense of community and solidarity. I don't think it's particularly Western Balkan thing. Many countries did prove that, but it was also the case here. Thank you.
Thank you, Djordje, and thank you, all three of you. I want to also thank our viewers, and I want to remind them that the next session will be next week, and then we'll have another one a week afterwards, and that during those sessions we'll talk in much more detail about particular issues, be it environment, be it education that was already mentioned, and issues that we as representative of the younger generation from the Western Balkans have already, before pandemic, identified as important but somewhat neglected issues in the debates on the Western Balkans and on the relations between the EU and the Western Balkans. At the end of this session, what remains is for me to thank you on behalf of the International Institute for for Peace, the Austrian Institute for International Affairs, and the Karl Renner Institute, to thank them on behalf of the panelists, myself, and the rest of our group, which is quite big and quite enthusiastic also about this part of our work, for offering us a platform where we can discuss this and share this, and to invite you to join us next Tuesday as well. To those that had questions for me personally, since I'm a moderator, I wasn't able to answer them, but I kindly invite you to send me an email and we can engage in discussions on one-on-one on many of these issues. Thank you, all three of you. Thanks, thank you, viewers, and see you next Tuesday. Bye-bye.